Dear students, welcome to the session on environmental education. I'm your tutor, Mr. David Sampson, and I'm going to take you through this presentation, especially the content areas with regard to environmental education 3 EE31. Now, before we delved into the content areas of EE, I first want us to look at a few technical aspects around when it comes to the examinations, which is very important. Each examination paper, or the 3 papers that you will write during the year, each section carries 40 marks each, which is important. It's important that you also observe the level of questioning for each of the sections in the paper. And it is important that you also understand what each of the questions in each of the 3 different sections requires from you as a student. When I talk about understand what the question requires, you will, by now you need to know, or you should know, that we get different level of questions in a question paper, especially when you are asked to either describe, explain, name, or discuss. So that is what I mean by the level of the questions. Now, normally when students start writing an examination, when they get a paper, they delve into the question, not reading the questions first properly, just page through the question paper and they start. But it's actually important for you as a student that you read the questions correctly before you start answering questions in the exams. What is also important, as students, you must write neatly and clearly so that I can at least, make out what you write in the examination, especially your answers, so that it can be clear, considering grammatical correctness. And then it is important that you answer what is required of you, or what a question requires. Sometimes students do not answer what the question requires of them. And obviously when you do that, when you move outside the scope of what the question requires, you do not get rewarded, and it's important that you take that into consideration. Another aspect of the technical aspects of the exams is that make sure that you read the instructions on the question papers. You must always answer all the questions in the exam paper because they're all compulsory. Strictly follow the numbering of questions as it appears in the question papers. And then check the allocation of marks for each of the questions in the different sections. And then when you are not sure about an answer, don't waste time on a question. You move on to the next one, because you can always come back and then answer that question which you had difficulty with. Which means go back to the unanswered question as long as you number the questions correctly. That is important. Now, then the next part, we will move into the content of the specific of the module itself, which means that we will start with the geography section, which contains a lot of content, and in most cases you will have to spend a lot of time on the 3 different sections to make sure that you cover the content in each of the sections. Now, the geography section contains content areas on, for example, earthquakes and volcanoes, on global warming, on weathering and climate. And then each of these different sections contains a lot of information with respect to each of the different sections in geography. What is also important is that for the geography sections, there are a lot of terms or concepts that each of the sections contain, which means that it's important that you understand the meaning of the different concepts and terms as well. Under the section, for example, under earthquakes and volcanoes, it is important that you should differentiate or know the difference between an earthquake and a volcano, because they are different. You need to differentiate or know the difference between divergent boundaries and transform fault boundaries. And then you also need to know what are the impacts or the damages that is involved when you, for example, have an earthquake or you have a volcano. For example, if you need to focus on the environmental impacts, for example, of volcanic eruptions, it means that it is important that you describe the environmental impacts of volcanoes, for example, or volcanic eruptions on the environment. So the focus is on environmental impacts or the damage to the environment. Okay. Then we also know that there might also be other impact or damages to or volcanic eruptions to people, as well as to the infrastructure, as well as to human beings, which means people can lose their lives, animals lose their lives, the infrastructure are damaged. And then when it comes to the environmental impacts, it means that the environment is also damaged. And then you have to know what environmental damages are caused by volcanic eruptions. What is also important is that earthquakes can also cause damages. So you also need to know what are the damages that earthquakes, for example, that can occur when you have earthquakes. Like you have damages to the environment and people and the infrastructure with regard to volcanoes, you also have damages with regard to with regard to earthquakes. Now, what is also important is that there's also a section covering global warming. You have to know what global warming is and how the Earth, for example, is heated. We know that the Earth is heated, and this basically leads to global warming. And then you also have to know what is the effect of climate, for example, on the natural vegetation, and also what are the main factors which affect climate. So it is the effect of climate on the natural vegetation, and then also the main factors which affect our climate. Another section which is covered under in the geography section is the section on weathering. You all should know what the concept weathering means, and you know that weathering refers to it's the breaking down and loosening of the surface minerals, for example, like rocks, by erosion, such as water, for example, wind, and ice. Now, it's also important that you know the different types of weathering that we get, such as, for example, mechanical weathering. There's chemical weathering as well as biological weathering. So we are looking at the three types or basic types of weathering that occurs under this section. Also in relation to weathering is the focus on the hydrological cycle. And we know that the hydrological cycle refers to the water cycle. We get a water cycle, and the water cycle basically refers to the movement of water, for example, above the earth, and then the movement of water below the surface of the earth as well. So the water cycle, as it occurs below or above the earth. Just don't focus on one or two of the types, the hydrological cycle, because there's a number of them as stipulated in your guide in terms of the water cycle and how the water cycle takes place. Another important aspect is the aspect of climate. You have to know what are the factors that which affect climate. You have to know the effect of climate on the natural vegetation, and then you should be able to also interpret a climate graph on what learners need to observe from the graph. Now, if we talk about factors affecting climate, it means that you have to look at what are the things that affects the climate, and then how does the effect of climate have on the natural vegetation. Natural vegetation usually refers to your plants as well as your animals, but in terms of natural vegetation, which means that the plants itself, how does the climate affect the plants? Now, in a previous exam paper, for example, students were asked to interpret a climate graph and what learners need to observe from the graph. So basically you should be able to know what a climate graph is and what you should be able to observe, for example, from the graph. What are the things that are on the climate graph and what you should know. And like I've mentioned earlier, that you do get terms, you do get concepts that you need to explain. For example, I've mentioned weathering as a concept, for example, that you need to understand and explain. You have to explain the meaning. Let me just get to the slide, and then so that I can each unit requires the definition of concepts from a geography perspective, as I've indicated. For example, you should be able to know the concept weathering. You should be able to describe the meaning, what it means. You should be able to, for example, know what is the concept compaction, what does it mean, what is a volcano, what is an earthquake, what is the meaning of the concept geoformology, and what is the meaning of the concept erosion, desertification, deforestation, and global warming, for example. But these are not the only ones, only terms and concepts that you get in your guide. So there is a section, for example, a vocabulary section where the concepts are mentioned and the definition are provided. Okay. Now, if we, in an exam, for example, you can be asked to define the following terms. For example, geoformology, as I've mentioned, define the concept erosion and define the concept weathering. Sometimes you can be asked to give the difference between ecology and ecology and erosion, for example. You can also be asked, for example, a question on global warming, where you need to explain how the earth is heated. You can be asked to analyze the 5 stages of the hydrological cycle or the water cycle. You can be asked to explain the environmental impact of volcanic eruptions, or you can be asked to explain the environmental impact of earthquakes, for example. Or not only the environmental impacts, you can be asked to explain, for example, the impact of volcanoes and the impact of earthquakes, for that matter. You can be asked to differentiate, or what is the difference between an earthquake or a volcano? What is the difference between divergent boundaries and transform fault boundaries? and then either list the main factors which affect climate. Soil formation is another important part of the section under geography, where you need to know the main factors of soil formation. Explain how you would teach learners to interpret a climate graph and what learners need to observe from the graph, which means that you first need to know what a climate graph is, and then what you should observe from a climate graph before you can be able to teach it to your learners, and that is very important. You also need to explain, or can be asked to explain, the basic types of weathering, as I've mentioned earlier: mechanical, biological, as well as mechanical, chemical, and biological weathering. Sometimes exam papers do not only contain questions that are phrased and where you need to be able to answer those questions, but sometimes diagrams can be used in an exam paper to draw out your understanding and knowledge on some of the questions. There are some diagrams in your guides, for example, in the guide that can be used in an exam paper to test your understanding or your knowledge or the information. One of the diagrams, for example, is the one on the hydrological cycle. So just to alert you to the fact, or emphasize the fact that diagrams can also be used in the exam paper where you need to answer any questions. So the first part, I was dealing with the section on geography. I know that what I've mentioned is not the only. I just scratched the surface of the section on geography, but you need to prepare yourself really properly when it comes to the geography section. I know it's a lot of content and information that you need to cover, but what is important is that don't be involved in any guesswork and say, okay, maybe this will not be asked in the exam, I will concentrate on this. It's important that you cover all the information, read as much as you can to understand the information, so that you will not be caught out when it comes to the examination. You must also understand that some of the assignment questions is also part of the preparation for be able to answer exam questions, for example. The second section is the history section, and this is actually the section where a lot of students lose a lot of marks, because sometimes they tend to spend more time on the geography and the biology section and think that they will get more marks in the two, and then the history section is usually neglected. A lot of students, most of the students so far, as I can remember, they lose a lot of marks on the history section because they do not prepare them well as far as this section is concerned. Now, in the history section, there's also a lot of information that is covered, starting from the occupation of Namibia in 1915 by South Africa. You need to read that section, understand why South Africa occupied Namibia in 1915, giving reasons, what led to the occupation of South Africa in 1915. There's also the section on the apartheid system. What is the meaning of the word apartheid itself? You know that the word apartheid has a meaning, and the system was supported by the introduction of different laws. And you have to know what were those different laws that were introduced during the apartheid era and the system. How was it structured? How was the lives of the Namibians, for example, affected by this apartheid system? especially the people in the country. We all know that not everybody was happy with the apartheid system, so what they did was they formed political parties. So you have to know who were the political parties that was established to resist or fight against apartheid as well. So you have to look at the apartheid system in totality. What the meaning, what was the effect of the system on the people, and who were the political parties that was formed to resist the system. We move to the next section under history is the world history. World history refers to, that there was in world history you need to know the different peace treaties and how effective these peace treaties was to preserve peace, especially after World War I and World War II. Now, when you talk about the effectiveness of peace treaties, it basically means that you will have to know what were the treaties that was introduced and how successful was the treaties towards preserving peace. So either you need to argue whether these peace treaties were very effective, or either whether the peace treaties was not effective. First and foremost, it's important that you have to know the formation of the League of Nations and the establishment of the United Nations. A lot of students get confused between the two. For example, you have to know when was the League of Nations formed and when was the United Nations formed. And both organizations, when they were formed, obviously there were weaknesses and there were strength, or they were successful or they were not successful. Now, sometimes when you are asked a question, for example, the weaknesses and successes of the League of Nations, students usually tell you the successes and the weaknesses of the United Nations, and then the other way around. So you have to be sure that when you are asked, for example, a question on the League of Nations, you have to know what was the successes and the failures of the League of Nations and not the United Nations. And when you ask a question, what are the successes and the failures of the United Nations, don't get confused with the information and then provide me with information that belongs to the League of Nations. So you have to make the distinction between the two organizations and what was the successes and the failures of both organizations. Another example is a section, for example, especially during the Second World War, was the Vietnam War, especially with regard to the effects and the consequences of the Vietnam War. How did the war, for example, affect the people of Vietnam? Now, usually, if you, for example, focus on the Vietnam War, there are basically three things involved. So the war affected the environment, it affected the people, both in Vietnam and, for example, in the USA. And then it also affected the country itself. For example, if we talk about Vietnam, basically the infrastructure. And when we talk about infrastructure, we usually refer to, roads, buildings, etc. So the war itself, what was the consequences of this war in terms of how it affected the environment, the people, the country. Now, you can be asked a question where you, for example, what was the consequences of the Vietnam War on the environment? And what was the consequences of the Vietnam War, for example, in general? What was the consequences of the Vietnam War? And then obviously you need to focus on the consequences on the environment, the people, and the country as a whole in terms of destruction to infrastructures, like roads, people, etc. And then killing of people, killing of animals, for that matter. Okay, now that, for example, is on the Vietnam War. Now, another war which was important is the Cold War. We know that this was not a physical war where people actually, were fighting amongst each other, but this was more a war of words instead of a physical war. Now, it's important that you know the meaning of the Cold War, what it means, what is the meaning of Cold War, why was NATO and the Warsaw Pact formed after the Second World War. So, firstly, NATO, and then we had the Warsaw Pact. So we had these two. So basically, so the Cold War, in terms of why were these two, why was it formed? The formation, or let's call it the formation. It's important that you need to know why was NATO formed during the Cold War, and why was the Warsaw Pact formed during the Cold War. So there were obvious reasons why these two were formed, and you have to know the why. It's important. And do not mix up the two. So sometimes the students mix them up, giving the reason in terms of why NATO was formed, but then it is actually the reason why the Warsaw Pact was formed, and then the other way around. So make sure that you know exactly why these two were formed. As I've mentioned earlier in the geography section, there's also definitions and concepts from this unit in history, which also contains some concepts which you need to know and understand, like capitalism. What is the meaning of the word capitalism? What is the meaning of the word imperialism? What is the meaning of the word socialism? And what is the meaning of the word Cold War, as I've just explained? What is the meaning of the word, for example, apartheid, and then genocide? So these are just a few concepts that is contained in the history unit, and which are important as well. Sample questions from the unit can focus on explain briefly what is meant by the following terms that I've just explained. Clarify the reasons for the South African occupation of Namibia in 1915, and state the apartheid laws introduced in 1964. I've mentioned earlier that the apartheid system the laws were introduced, so it's important that you know what these laws were. And then discuss the effectiveness of the peace treaties between 1990 and 1923. So basically it means that you have to know what was the peace treaties introduced between 1990 and 1923, and then were they effective in terms of preserving world peace. I've mentioned the League of Nations as well as the United Nations, especially the weaknesses and the strength of the two organizations with respect to maintaining world peace. And then explain why NATO and the Warsaw Pact were formed after the Second World War. It can either be the one or it can be both, where you need to explain both. Why were they formed? And then, as I've mentioned, the weaknesses or the successes of the League of Nations, as mentioned earlier. Okay. The last section is the section on biology. This section also covers a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, a lot of understanding. Basically, it also means that you have to read a lot in this section, because it covers a lot of content from sexual reproduction, the advantages of sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction, the female reproductive system, the male reproductive system, the role of hormones, and the effect and the function of hormones in the male and the female body, and the role of testosterone, for example, and estrogen, the female sex reproductive system, as well as the DNA and as the code on which all life is based, and also the function of DNA. So just to repeat, it is the section on asexual and sexual reproduction, the advantages and the disadvantages of asexual and sexual reproduction, the issue of sexual reproduction in humans with reference to the male and female reproductive system, and the role of hormones, and then the role of testosterone and estrogen, and the female reproductive and sexual organs. There's also, it's important that you study the diagrams of the two organs, the male and the female reproductive organs, so that you know what the different parts are and what the different functions of each of the sexual organs are, as labeled, for example, in the two sketches. It's called diagrams. It's either a diagram or a sketch of the two organs, and it's important that you also know the functions of each of the organs. There's a section on DNA as the code on which all life is based, and you also need to know the function, for example, of DNA itself. The section also covers seed disposals. You should be able to know how seeds are disposed of, and the methods. Water, for example, can dispose seeds, as well as animals. Water, animals, and wind disposal. There's a section on global warming, and especially what are the effects of global warming, especially the negative effects. Sometimes, usually there's no positive effects of global warming, but more negative effects of global warming. And there's also a section on conservation, especially when it comes to the natural environment, meaning that we need to be able to know and understand why should we conserve or protect our natural environment. So it's conservation of the natural environment. Meaning, protection. How can we protect, or how can we conserve? Which means that you need to know what should we do. We basically look at the positive things. The positive things that we can do to conserve or protect the environment. So there are certain things that we can do to make sure that our natural environment are protected. So basically, it's important that you need to know why is it important that we protect our natural environment, and what are the things that we can do to protect our environment. As I've explained in the other two sections, there's concepts and terms that you need to know and be able to explain when you are asked in an examination. Explain the concept genotype, phenotype, natural selection, artificial selection, ecology, ecosystems, mitosis, and meiosis. These are just some of the concepts that you need to know and understand to be able to explain them if you are asked to do that. I've also mentioned earlier the female and male reproductive systems. You need to know, you should be able to, from a diagram, for example, in an examination, if it is given to you, to be able to know what is the specific part that is labeled in a sketch and what is the function of that specific part in the diagram, and then explain what the functions are, for example. It requires, which means that if the sketch is given to you or the diagram is given to you, you should be able, it requires you to label first the structure. You have to know the structure and then explain the function of each of the structures as labeled in the diagram. An example, for example, the diagram of a male reproductive system, and then you should be able to know what is the function of that. Also, for example, the male reproductive system, you can do the same for the female reproductive system, is where you make a little table for yourself where you write down the male reproductive system on one side, like the urethra or the seminal vesicle, and then on the other side you write function and then indicate what is the specific function of the specific part of the male reproductive system. And even you can do the same for the female reproductive system, where you have a little diagram for yourself, and then which makes it easier for you to, especially when you study or you do revision on the different parts, where you know exactly what the part is and what the function of the different parts are. Sample questions can be list or mention, or maybe describe, explain functions of estrogen, explain the effects of testosterone, for example, in males, describe the function of DNA, explain the risk, for example, of cloning, differentiate, or what is the difference between sexually and asexual reproduction. And then plants can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Can be a statement, and then from the statement you can be asked to differentiate between the two types of reproduction. Explain the advantages or the disadvantages of asexual reproduction. Explain the negative effects of global warming, or discuss or explain the importance of conservation of the natural environment. Please keep in mind that this presentation and the examples I've given you, these are just examples of what you can expect when you prepare yourself for examination, but you need to focus on the scope of each and every section as it is provided to you when you prepare for the exams. This presentation doesn't mean that it is examination. It is just to give you a taste or an example of what you need to prepare yourself for. Also looking at the other sections of the content. You can contact me by the details that are provided on the slide, or you can, either by email or by cell, especially after 5. And I wish you all the best in terms of your preparation for the examination for this year.